Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. I have a very good friend who is an INTJ, and he was raised by an ENTP father and an INFJ mother. And one would think he would be really lucky, right? Because he's got two intuitive parents, two people who can understand him and help foster his intuitive creativity.
Perfect blend.
Perfect blend. Unfortunately, they weren't terribly healthy people, and that goes, of course, outside of type. But I'm really catching on to this idea that something that's healthy that isn't ideal is almost always better than something that's unhealthy, even if conceptually it's ideal. And in this particular situation or circumstance, this INTJ friend of mine, his father, who was an ENTP, was one of the mad scientist style ENTPs. Always had an idea, always had some widget he was working on, always had some great idea he was just waiting for somebody to help him capitalize on.
Like a literal inventor.
Yeah, exactly, like a literal inventor. And he, unfortunately, because he sort of lived by the skin of his teeth and was always following one harebrained idea after another. I mean, he was actually a solid inventor. He just didn't have the other things that come along with making an idea successful. Having a great idea, being able to implement it is one thing. Being able to connect with the right people, be able to position yourself to not just have the thing, but also the opportunities that come with it. He didn't have any of that stuff. And so there was a lot of getting kicked out of apartments because they couldn't pay their rent, and some living in vans sometimes, and some, just trying to fit into a world that wasn't really accommodating how he worked, and not having the sophistication to be able to just sort of make peace with reality, establish himself, and then try to get his ideas pushed forward. Basically, he was trying to skip steps, which is a total intuitive thing to do, particularly an ENP thing to do. People who lead with extroverted intuition or exploration, that is one of the biggest things that we have to learn, is you can't skip steps. And my friend's father never learned that lesson. And so, it was really tough on them. His INFJ mother had a lot of depression issues. It was hard for her to show up for the family. So she wasn't really taking the lead in making sure the kids were getting what they needed beyond the bare minimum. So effectively, as he was the oldest son in his family. And so as the oldest son, and as an INTJ, he felt like it was his job to try to compensate for sort of the lack that he was experiencing. And so, of course, his instinct was to implement ideas in a very extroverted thinking or effectiveness way. That would be his auxiliary or Copilot function. It would be the way that he naturally sees how systems should be set up. Like, you set things up by setting systems up. And then once you establish and set up a system, then you can layer other things on top of it. And from a very early age, like his early teens, he was trying to set these systems up in behalf of his family because he was compensating for there being really no systems. And you can imagine, man, it's so hard on kids to live that kind of lifestyle anyway, where they're with parents that are always chasing a dream that is never coming to fruition, and they're the ones who end up suffering for it. Like he talks about how he basically lived in hand-me-down sweatpants, and he was always that kid, right? He was like the kid in school who was always getting made fun of. And, he didn't really understand it. He kind of understood it, but it took a long time to figure it out. So anyway, the point of all this is every time he would do what he's naturally wired to do, which is to start setting up systems in the outside world, his father and his mother unintentionally, and I think probably his father unintentionally too. His father unconsciously intentionally, and his mother unconsciously unintentionally would frustrate his extroverted thinking implementation. Like every time he tried to set up a system, it would get messed up. And when I say unconsciously intentionally, I mean his father did not mean to demoralize him. That wasn't the intent. But the extroverted thinking or effectiveness system to this unhealthy ENTP was, for whatever reasons, you could psychologically deconstruct it all day long, but for whatever reasons was offensive to him. And so he would frustrate the attempts over and over and over again until my INTJ friend just kind of went, screw it. Okay, fine. And got caught in a loop, right? Which of course is what is going to naturally happen. And it took him decades to recover, decades. Because when he went to his auxiliary function to develop it, there was trauma in there. There was a lack of approval from parents. There was limiting beliefs. There were, sort of the neurons that fire together, wire together. Well, the neurons that were firing at the same time he was trying to set up systems were wiring to not only parental disapproval and frustration, but also something's going to come and mess this up. So there's no way that I can possibly complete this.
When you say mess up, the word that comes to mind for me is undermine, probably in very subtle, unconscious ways.
That's exactly it, right? It was undermining. And that's what, for those of us who have extroverted feeling or harmony, that's part of the reason, that's part of the way that we dismantle things, is we undermine them. And so both of his parents were on the introverted thinking, extroverted feeling, or accuracy, harmony, polarity. And so both of his parents came with undermining energy to everything he tried to set up. So the reason why I'm describing this entire situation is because this is a classic case, or my friend is kind of a classic case of somebody who, and he knows about typology. He understands all of this. But whenever he would go do the thing that he knew he needed to do, which was develop that auxiliary or copilot function, he would just hit wall after wall after wall. And that begs the question, what do you do when you have trauma or trauma associated with your auxiliary or copilot function? Like, what do you do? Like, how do you get through all of that? And how could it look? And I can resonate with this as an ENTP. I have introverted thinking or accuracy as my copilot or auxiliary function. Every time I said things that were honest for me, that were radically honest for me, and every time something didn't make sense in the paradigm that I was raised in, and I asked questions about it, penetrating questions that made other people uncomfortable, I would always get statements like, you're not allowed to ask that. Or you can ask that question, but you must come to this conclusion. And it was a lot of run around and spin around, and you're not allowed to say that because that's an uplifting conversation. You're discouraging people, you're making people feel bad, and that makes you bad, right? Like, God does not approve of people who are demoralizing others or not having quote unquote uplifting conversation. And so I wired a lot of the same stuff, right? It's wrong to use this function. So when I started using it, I also had layers and layers and layers of all sorts of connected pathways that told me that it was wrong to go down this path, or that I just assumed it would end up in disaster.
I had a very similar upbringing in that I'm an ENFP in the Myers-Briggs system. My co-pilot auxiliary function is introverted feeling. It's all about my core values, my motivations, understanding what resonates with me as true and right. And I was taught in my faith background, very Judeo-Christian framework, that you cannot trust your feelings. You cannot trust how you feel about something. Your feelings will lead you astray. God is the only one that you can trust, and you have to suppress all the feelings that you have. And so I learned how to shut off a lot of my internal metrics that would help me navigate my life, and I created my own trauma by following what I was taught. And not to say you should as a feeler person, I don't think you should hand yourself over to your feelings, but they certainly inform us feelers that use it as our decision-making process. It helps us navigate the world much better. And I think everyone probably has a little bit of this for their co-pilot auxiliary, whatever your personality type is. If you're an INFJ, you might have wounding in your extroverted feeling. If you're an INFP or an INTP, you might have wounding in your extroverted intuition, your perceiving process, right? That co-pilot auxiliary. So I think everybody's probably got some measure of this. Some people are more harmed by the trauma of that process, and other people may have had a better time of it. Some people have wounding because it was indulged too much, right? It's not just because it was suppressed. It might have been allowed to grow maybe even more than your driver or your dominant function. You were allowed to express it more or be there more, encouraged to be there more, and it got overused, and so you over-relied on it. That's typically not the case, but there could be trauma living here on both sides of these.
I haven't seen as many cases of what you're talking about there, which is overuse of it that creates trauma. Do you have a specific example in mind that would look like that?
There was an ISFP woman a few years ago I coached, as a specific example comes to mind off the top of my head. And she was into all sorts of extreme sports and very outgoing, like very active in her extroverted sensing Copilot auxiliary function, to the point where, as you know, it was a profiling session. I was profiling her and trying to determine her type and also some coaching associated with it. I was surprised at how much my normal advice would be, hey, this is probably a Copilot auxiliary problem or challenge in your life. I was surprised how that wasn't the challenge at all. She had been allowed to be in that space for whatever reason, but she didn't know who she was. She was lost in her life. She was untethered from who she truly was in that world. And I realized, she had been indulging that too much. It had been something that was so much a part of her. She'd actually shut off her driver in a lot of ways, her dominant function of introverted feeling as an ISFP, and had just handed herself over to the experiences she was having.
I could see that happening with somebody who leads with introverted feeling or authenticity. I could see that happening if that function was, because that's a function that is not often, can be considered very self-indulgent by the outside world. And people who lead with introverted feeling can get pushed out of that space a lot because they're told that they're not being industrious enough. But if you compensate by, like some IFPs do that by going to their inferior or 3-year-old by trying to just be busy all the time or like get a lot of stuff done. And I think others can go to their auxiliary function to be acceptable or to be exciting or interesting. And I think that could definitely be something that would tip the balance.
But it's not typical, though. I mean, I'm talking about extreme here. Obviously, it's usually trauma of suppression or repression.
Yeah. No, I think the reason why I wanted to focus on that is because I actually think that there's a lot of different interesting and not terribly optimal relationships we can create with that auxiliary function, which makes it so that when you and I say things like, I've mentioned it multiple times before, this is a sound bite. All right, this is a sound bite, meaning that it's not the full story. If you take one thing away from hundreds of hours of podcasts that we've recorded, we want you to take away the leverage point of developing the auxiliary function, which is arguably a lifetime of work if you want to get it more and more and more refined. Sometimes we hit a lot of diminishing returns on that work, and it's better for us to move on to other work, which I would argue is a balancing. The next piece is a balancing of your auxiliary and tertiary or your Copilot and 10-year-old. You need to integrate that 3-year-old or inferior function aspiration. We've been doing a lot of conversation with our friend Dario Nardi, and he's really on this thing about the 6th function, which I'm super coming around to. That's really some of the highest leverage things to do, even maybe more than doing inferior aspiration work, is to focus on the 6th function. And we'll probably have more information around that in the future because there's a lot of great work that he's doing on that 6th function that I think is really cool. But that's a little teaser for the future. But that said, that auxiliary function, we talk about it all the time as a soundbite, and it's because we do often have an interesting and weird relationship with it. It's something that we're naturally wired to have skill around, and we're kind of avoidant of it. So it's an interesting relationship. What do you do with something? What you do is you take it for granted. That's actually what you do. When you have a natural predisposition to something, but you don't desire it, is you take it for granted. And it's really easy to overinflate your capacity there. It's really easy to use it as a one-trick pony, which is only use it in one style over and over and over again and hope that that's the thing that will be enough. But I think this conversation around trauma is it's something that we haven't really discussed before. We've talked about all those other different styles of dynamic you can have with your auxiliary function. But the idea that trauma can live in there, or at least be associated with that function, I don't think we've really talked about that. And I see people, like we already mentioned a couple different ways that this can show up for somebody who has extroverted thinking, so ITJs, or who those that use effectiveness. For people who have that as their auxiliary function, the trauma that can be in there is, they're trying to make things happen in the outside world, and they get frustrated by people who are threatened by them or that don't like it themselves, who see it as maybe overbearing. Like, I mean, people talk a lot about being raised by TJs and feeling like they've had trauma from the TJs who just wanted to get things done and didn't want to talk about feelings and didn't really understand that. But TJs can have trauma from other people finding that function overbearing and trying to stamp it down as well. That can happen too. The road does not go one way. TJs can totally have trauma around that. And my friend's example is a perfect example of that. An ENTP, and as a fellow ENTP, I get it. Extroverted thinking can very much feel like it's trying to box me in, it's trying to boss me around. It's my sixth function. So doing work of making peace with it has been pretty impactful for me. And also, I tend to not particularly like that function. So imagine me having a TJ child and then constantly frustrating their attempts to use it. That's going to create trauma. For me, with introverted thinking, the trauma comes in being told that I'm not being a good person. I'm a bad person if I'm saying these things, even if they're true things. That I need to be towing the party line, and I need to be seeing things through the lens of the adults around me. I need to be agreeing with teachers or, authority figures, even if I don't think they're accurate, even if it doesn't make any sense to me. Even if my questions are sincere, right? They're not intending to threaten anybody. That can feel very threatening. You talk about introverted feeling or authenticity and this idea of don't trust it, right? Never trust it. Well, and also, I'm raising a little EFP, I think. And with Piper using introverted feeling, I mean, it is drama, as a little EFP, like everything is some sort of like
No.
extreme emotional experience, and I'm just like, whew, it is a ride. And I'm trying not to tamp down her introverted feeling, but it just gets too much for me.
I don't even notice. You're like, she's so dramatic. I'm like, what? Oh, yeah, I guess she's being dramatic. That's cool.
Well, she's trying out all of these emotions, and she wants to feel them to the nth degree to really understand them and understand herself. But my God, my extroverted feeling, my harmony 10-year-old or tertiary just gets massively overwhelmed. And I'm like, can we just neuter the emotions a little bit, just like dial it down. It's at 11. Let's just go down to 4 or 5.
See, I try to compete with her. I'm like, oh, you feel that? I can amp that up 10 times. Here we go. And it's like this. It's great. It's a great household to live in for you, I'm sure.
Which is why I'm very fortunate to have you as her father and help guide her in the ways of the introverted feeling. But also, I do feel sandwiched between these two like very dramatic humans. And that's cool. I mean, I've made my life choices. I'm happy with them. But that's something that can happen with introverted feeling is somebody like me comes along, is overwhelmed and can't understand the intensity of feeling. And so then I tell her to stop, right? And that can also create trauma in that function. And then with extroverted feeling or harmony, like, man, there's so many IFJs who have trauma around seeking approval and connection in the people in their lives, and then just being betrayed or being given disapproval, or just getting all these messages that no, they're not good people. They're not worthy of connection. They're not approved of, and or that desire to connect and to serve ends up being exploited, and then they get betrayed, or they're in these bad dynamics that they now have to try to get out of. Those are the ways that it can really show up for the judging functions. But I was thinking, how do you have trauma in your perceiving functions? And then it struck me, well, I mean, this is what intuitives talk about, particularly ENJs and INPs. If you have intuition as your auxiliary function, you can, there's a lot of, well, you can't know that, or how do you know, or, don't talk about stuff that you don't know anything about, or why are you such a weirdo? And if you're showing up with your intuition, with extroverted intuition, it's like, it's too much for people a lot of times. And the desire to constantly be talking about things and brainstorming, that doesn't make any sense to anybody. And I have an INTP friend who was raised in an environment that was not okay with it, and they took him to a psychiatrist saying he's broken. And then I've had ENJ friends who are using introverted intuition as an auxiliary or perspectives as a copilot, and they just get really good at hiding it, right? That's not an acceptable part. And so they use it, but they rarely use it, because every time they share their impressions or visions with others, and they're told they're being presumptuous, or that they're leaping to conclusions, they're jumping to conclusions, and they can't know that and to stop doing that. And unfortunately with ENJs, or actually just EJ types in general, they are so often rewarded for that dominant or driver function that if they want to push away or sort of sublimate that auxiliary function, that copilot function, they can get away with it for a long time. So what crosses supports you and what supports you crosses you. For EJs, it's the ability to basically just avoid the auxiliary function, particularly if it's causing them pain and that pain is overwhelming. So for ENJs, I mean, it's easy to see for the intuitive types, for the intuitive auxiliaries, how they could have trauma or wounding there. But for sensors, I was like, well, wouldn't ESJs all be rewarded for their sensory function, right? Isn't that kind of the stereotype about how life works? But I have seen ESJs, like the trauma is actually the trauma associated with the things that have happened in their past. When they have had terrible experiences that, I mean, it's as close to related. If you have introverted sensing, remember, as your auxiliary function, and you have trauma from your past, you have trauma in your auxiliary or that copilot. Like it's as closely associated with real life experiences as any of the functions. And so the desire to just stay busy and not have to look at that stuff and not have to think about it. Like one of the most powerful exercises an ESJ can do is to do a timeline exercises of all the impactful moments of their entire life. But if they were abused growing up, or if they just had terrible things that happened to them, it's really hard to go back and revisit them and really work through those legit experiential traumas. Like my nephew Dimitri's an ESFJ. His mom died when he was 8. His dad, who was just racked with pain, could not handle my sister's death, remarried somebody within 9 months of my sister dying because he just could not handle his grief, and then moved my nephew across the country away from all of his friends and family, all the way over. We were living in Portland, Oregon, moved all the way over to Boston, Massachusetts, with a stepmom that wasn't particularly nice to him. It was the grief that my ex-brother-in-law was experiencing that had him make all of these choices. And I know that he was dealing with massive trauma himself around all of it, because my sister's death was completely out of nowhere. And I mean, they were so young. She's in her early 30s. And here's this little 8-year-old boy who has all of this stuff coming down on him, and he just stayed busy. As an ESFJ, he was just like, well, this is just reality. I'm going to make peace with it, but also I'm just going to keep going forward. And it took him years to revisit that time period and work through any of that grief. So that's how somebody who has sensing as an auxiliary function could very much have trauma trapped in there. And then with extroverted sensing, your example of somebody who went there and overdid it in order to avoid trauma actually in their dominant or driver. But I was thinking of some ISPs that I know that when they were really young, they were full of life. Like there's some shy ISFPs out there and ISTPs. But when they're young and they get into that extroverted sensing part, they're present and energetic and full of life. And a lot of them have had labels slapped on them, right? They're ADD or ADHD, or those are the moments when they're in that space of just being present, full of life and a bundle of energy and adrenaline oriented. When they're really little, they're not controllable. That's really hard energy to control. And if you don't have a parent that is sophisticated enough to give space to that child to be able to just fully embody all of that extroverted sensing or sensation energy, those are the moments when they get slapped down a lot. Sit in your seat, don't get fidgety, be quiet, or they're told that they're making bad choices in those moments because they're not being, they're not future pacing enough, or they're being too self-indulgent, or whatever it is that a parent might believe about that function and how it shows up. And so then it's really easy to associate being in that space with people disapproving of you and thinking that you're not doing the thing you're supposed to be doing. And so it doesn't matter who you are or what the function is. All of us can have trauma and a lot of bad feedback from the outside world based on those auxiliary functions, and the people in our lives not knowing how important that part of us is, including the importance of being able to try it out and iterate it. Like, when we're working on these functions, we're going to do it poorly for a time. And we're not going to, we shouldn't be really throttling it as children. We should be seasoning it. We should be figuring out how it works over time, and we need a little bit of space to make mistakes. And for some reason, when we make mistakes in our dominant function, well, not for some reason, when we make mistakes in our dominant function, most of the time, every once in a while there's an anomaly, but most of the time, we're just going to do it anyway, right? We're going to use that dominant function. It's who we are. It's how we identify ourselves. The tertiary and inferior functions are ones that we don't have as much control over anyway. And so, we've already talked about our relationship with the tertiary. We overvalue our ability to use it. We get ego around it, but it's in the same attitude as the dominant or the driver. So it's more easily accessible. But for some reason, when we get bad feedback in the Copilot or auxiliary function, we take it so personally. And while we're going to be naturally skilled at it, like we are with our driver, we're not going to clock as much time. So there's going to be skill, less interest, and a little less natural talent. And so when we use it, we get bad feedback. We need to be using it more to be able to determine the best use of it. But we're so sensitive to the feedback around it, and we just go, fine, I'll just go back to the attitude that I'm more comfortable in anyway. Screw this. And then we allow it to go dormant. So the thing that I believe that we don't get is space. Like, we don't get space to make mistakes in that auxiliary function as much, and then we don't give ourselves space. We get all this feedback that we're not supposed to be bad at it and we're supposed to be doing better. And then we get kind of perfectionistic around it. And if we don't show up well immediately, we shut it down. We get really sensitive to the feedback. We have all this weird, wiring that gets associated and globbed on it with lack of approval or you should have done better. And we just, and then we end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
It's been my observation that a lot of times we do shut it down, but often one aspect of it comes out and we over-rely on that one thing, almost like a hammer to everything that's not even a nail, right? And so that's what was coming up for me as you're talking. And the other piece of this too is, this is something, as you're talking, I'm like, okay, what do we do with this information? Like this is great. We're defining something. There might be some trauma here. So what? If there's no action line, if there's nothing to do from it, nothing to look at and observe about ourselves, what is the point? And I would say that the HAT model came up for me as you were talking. And the HAT model, we've done a podcast on this before, and HAT is an acronym. It stands for Healing, Achievement, and Transcendence. And we here, Personality Hacker, Antonia and myself, and our team tend to look at personal growth as a three-legged race in these broad areas, these broad categories of either healing, you're doing personal growth around healing, so healing trauma or working on your shadow, integrating that into yourself, achievement, setting goals, working on self-esteem, hitting measurable markers and building something in the outer world or working on something inside yourself, or transcendence, finding a connection with the divine, the spiritual, a practice, a discipline that helps you get that spirit going in yourself. And I think what we're talking about here is you're unpacking this idea of trauma in the Copilot or auxiliary of our personality. You're talking about the things that need to be healed in that. And maybe you've been really good at using your Copilot auxiliary function for achievement. Like maybe you are world-class at getting it to achieve for you. Or maybe you've connected to the divine. You've had a spiritual awakening. And just because you had a spiritual awakening doesn't mean you're necessarily healed. I think people can have awakenings without being healed. And it means that there's healing work probably to do there. And that's a different kind of work in that process. There's so much to do here. You mentioned earlier, Antonia, there's a lifetime of work in our Copilot auxiliary just alone, not to mention the rest of our personality and how our mind is wired. And so we might have done tons of work in achievement, tons of work in transcendence. And here, this healing part, why can't I get to where I want to be in life? Why, I've achieved where I want to achieve. I've had my spiritual awakenings, but I still feel hollow or broken, or I feel like something's wrong. Well, maybe it's the healing part that you need to look at. And that's maybe not as obvious to us in there that has to be healed. Maybe it is obvious. If you're a healing type of person, maybe that's where you've really focused on is achievement or transcendence is more for you. But I think that's a really interesting model to lay over this, to say which category do you believe that function, that Copilot auxiliary lives in? And as we're talking here, this aspect of it lives in that healing framework.
Yeah, and I think the first place to go is to figure out, like, in what way is that auxiliary process, what is the damage that was done? Like, where was the abuse? And I don't even mean abuse in the sense of like you had an abuser and now you need to go confront them and I'm not really even talking about it in such an intentional way.
The bruising. Where's the wound or the bruising?
Yeah, exactly. Because we can be unintentionally abused. And in fact, that's actually kind of called the human experience. There's a lot of moments when we were kind of banged around a little bit and we didn't really, like, nobody meant it. It was just people rubbing up against each other. So in what way was that auxiliary function? How did it take some caustic energy that it really didn't need to? Like, that it wasn't deserving of that. And so the feedback, really what in those moments, what it comes down to, I think, is we got feedback from the outside world that was more reflective of the person giving the feedback than the reality of the situation. Somebody communicated to us that there was something unacceptable about this part of who we are. And that actually had nothing to do with us. It had to do with them because they didn't like it for some reason. And because they're a different person and they were dealing with their own stuff, then whatever they thought they saw in us in that, in what was being represented in auxiliary. And of course, this goes for all healing work, but we're just going to apply it specifically to that function. Whatever was going on for them as they were looking at that function, it was offensive to them in some way. Like it was triggering them in all sorts of ways. And so then they gave us feedback that was maybe feedback they needed to hear, or again, reflective of what was going on for them. But we didn't know that because we were little. We're little kids, or we're still just kind of trying to figure out how it all works. And again, people don't give us much space when it comes to stuff that like this. Like, for some reason, the auxiliary function doesn't get nearly as much space as it needs to make the mistakes it needs to make, which of course is one of the reasons why we put off auxiliary function work, by the way, is because we know we're going to have to go back to a younger version of ourselves. We're going to have to meet that function at the age that we stopped developing it at, and we're going to get into a space where we're going to make a lot of mistakes. And it's going to be really, it's going to be clumsy. It's going to be a clumsy tool in our hands. And so we don't want to go back and revisit that. We don't want to be clumsy and make a lot of mistakes and have to test iterate. And yet, if we meet the function where it's at, it's not even beginning. We don't even have to start with that clumsiness. We first start with acceptance. We have to ask ourselves, where did we get wounding in this function? What were the messages we got that told us that it was unacceptable? And can we understand that didn't have anything to do with us, or had very little to do with us? We may have just been a catalyst, not even the thing that, like we might have triggered somebody else's thing, and it literally had 5% to do with us. We just happened to exist in that moment in front of them. And so can we separate out these messages, these damaging, hurtful messages, from the thing that we were bringing, from us, personally? My friend Dave recently sent me a meme that I can't remember who it was. I wish I could attribute her, but I can't remember who said the quote. But it's a basic personal development principle. So probably wasn't the first person to say it. So who all the people who've ever said this quote, assume I'm attributing you. Don't take somebody else's inability to love you as a sign that you're unlovable. And it's the same concept for the auxiliary. Don't take somebody else's offense at how you used your auxiliary function as a sign that your auxiliary function is offensive. It's not, and it should have space to grow and develop. And so as you're figuring all this stuff out, the first thing you have to do is simply accept it for what it is. I have to accept introverted thinking or accuracy for what it is. It is a ball-busting function. It questions everything. It doesn't respect positions of authority as much as it does respect competence and bringing a refined thought to the table. And it needs things to be put in terms of honesty and sincerity. And it points out the absurd. And not everybody likes the absurd to be pointed out because it fucks with their narratives. But that's what it does. That's part of what the function does. And it's just not warm and fuzzy. It's not. And I have to accept that's part of what I bring. It's not all going to be bunnies and rainbows and sunshine. It's going to feel like surgery sometimes to myself and to other people. So the first thing I have to do is accept that. And then I have to accept that not everybody's going to accept that. I have to go, okay, and there's going to be a bunch of people who aren't okay with that. And I have to be okay with that. I have to be okay with that. I'm not for everyone. And then I have to go, all those times when people told me that I was using it poorly, is that true? Was I using it poorly and I need to be calibrated? Or was that about them? And sometimes it's 50-50. Sometimes they were giving me great feedback that I really need to hear. And sometimes they were just full of shit. And I need to accept that too. And then I need to learn to love this part of who I am and understand that this is the gift I bring to the world and form a relationship with it and be grateful that it exists. And then once I've healed, then I can get to the test, iterate, and giving myself space. Because if I love this part of me, I'll love its growth process too.
So we're talking about this in the framework of the auxiliary or Copilot. But any part of your personality, if you looked at your personality and any one of the positions in your car model, for example, had a healing work to do, that same process would apply. It might show up a little differently because you use them a little differently, but that would be a very similar process for all of that. And I think that's an excellent pathway to apply this to something we can actually do in our lives, to take this, apply it for actually seeking change and seeking betterment and healing for ourselves.
Yeah, I think that if I were to recommend one exercise to come from this particular podcast, it's to take a moment to sit down and really write out all of the ways in which you're grateful that you're wired the way that you are. Like, this comes under the concept of type patriotism, which is believing that your personality type is actually the best. And you should have a little bit of that, because really what it is it's associated with gratitude.
Self-love.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly. And like going, yeah, I'm awesome. I'm the shit. So just sitting down and writing all the ways in which you are so glad that you have that auxiliary or Copilot function, that you're wired to be, to be there. And if you are stuttering, if you're having a hard time figuring it out and going, I don't actually like it, that is a sign that you have trauma there. Like that you have trauma in your auxiliary function. Because if you can't come to a place of acceptance, then why would you not accept a massive part of yourself? It's because there's healing work that needs to happen. So first of all, just diagnose whether or not you have that trauma. And second, if you can get through that piece, writing down all the ways in which you're grateful that this part of you exists and you show up to the world representing it. And write down, I would say go to a dozen ways in which this auxiliary function is fantastic and facilitates you and facilitates your life and is a gift to other people, even if they don't accept it. And all the ways in which that you're happy you grew it to the place where it's at, and the ways in which you would like to grow it more. And then just kind of sit with that and really accept this part of who you are. And then if you need to, go down the list. Do it with your dominant, do it with your tertiary and your inferior, or basically all the other passengers in the car. And just really give yourself and your function some love.
I want to give a warning as you do this. If you identify, let's just take the auxiliary Copilot function for your personality type. If you're a new listener, by the way, search car model on our website, personalityhacker.com, and you're going to see a car model diagramming out what we're talking about here and how your functions for your personality lay out on this map. And the warning I have for the Copilot is that when you start to identify and work on the healing aspects of the Copilot auxiliary function, it will disrupt the other good things you got going with it. So if you've got achievement hooked up to it, or you've got transcendence hooked up to it, and things are running smoothly, and you start to mess with this thing, you start to do the gratitude exercise Antonia's talking about, and you start to work on it, and you start to focus on it, the things you've come to rely upon it for are going to be disrupted. And you're going to go, wait, I'm doing the wrong thing. This is ruining my life. I'm going way off the rails here. Like this happened to me from a personal experience of starting to work on my introverted feeling. Now I can't get as much done. My achievement got massively derailed. And here I'm in a healing process, and I can't seem to get my introverted feeling to support me toward the achievement that it always has supported me for. It's busy doing other things, healing itself. And here I can't get things done. I can't get things going. I'm focused on this. It's really frustrating. I'm maddened by it. It's like bringing you to tears almost. This most likely will happen in your life. If you're working on this, it's going to disrupt the ways you relied upon it because you've been leaning on it in a certain way, but it's kind of like overusing a muscle in your body. And then you're like, I need to start using my other muscles. And then that muscle's you're not able to use it as much or with as much nuance anymore because you're growing the other muscles around it. And so it kind of throws things out. Maybe that's not a good meta. I don't know if that happens. Does that even happen? Do we even exercise muscles that haven't been used that throws things out? I don't know. That might be a bad metaphor or analogy. I think you get the point though, hopefully. And, but I think that's the idea is that you're going to have disruption. You're going to have trouble when you do this. So hang in there because it's going to be a process. And it takes a little bit of faith that if I focus on healing myself, if I focus on working on these parts of me, the faith is that it's calibrating me more, and I'm going to have a good experience on the other end of this experience, even though it feels in the moment totally chaotic. It's like rehabbing a house. You tear out all the walls while you're rehabbing. There's dust everywhere. It looks terrible while you're rehabbing it. The house isn't even functional sometimes. You got to stop. You got to stay at a hotel while you're fixing something maybe. And then when it's all done, it looks great. You can move back in. But at the time, it gets all disrupted. That's a better analogy, isn't it?
That was an analogy that worked.
that one worked. The whole muscle thing. I'm like, where did that come from? That doesn't work at all.
Maybe I shouldn't use analogies with the different disciplines that I'm not that familiar with. I liked how you said with introverted feeling, you're almost in tears. Don't lie to the people.
Oh, no, I'm saying person, I was actually third personing it. I was definitely in tears personally. I was trying to say they may not be in tears if they're a different personality type.
Yeah,
like you listening.
Because if you're using introverted feeling, the answer.
Oh God, yes.
You're always in tears.
It's just in tears of frustration, of sadness, of trauma, of whatever. It's just it's horrible.
Man, I've gone through a time period recently where I've been working a little bit on introverted feeling as my seventh function, and I'm just like, this is terrible. I don't know how you people get through it.
Imagine an IFP. This is their life, man. They're there all the time.
Yeah, but exactly. So they figured it out. For me as my seventh function, I'm just like, this is miserable. I got to get out of here. And it kept pulling me in, and I kept having to work on it. But I'm like, I guess it's the same as looking at somebody with introverted thinking and being like, wow, you destroy all your relationships. That must suck. Everybody's got something, right? Everybody's got something they got to work through. So yes, totally. Actually, I think that's a fantastic point. And I'm glad you brought it up, which is that it's going to be disruptive, but all healing work is. So give yourself a little bit of space. That's a lot of the answer to a lot of life's problems is slow down and give yourself some space. And anytime you have healing work to do or you have trauma in something, and I'm assuming that if this is a particularly interesting topic to you, it's because you have identified you do have trauma in your auxiliary function. Just remember, slow down and give yourself some space. And the space that you're giving yourself is the space to mess up. It's the space to you're test iterating something. It's the space to see yourself fail multiple times. And then just remember the old adage, the Samuel Beckett adage, fail again, fail better. So it's a matter of getting better over time. And then once that muscle is really built, I mean, it's just a powerhouse. And then you can move on to more sophisticated things.
Okay, now we need to hear from you. You've been listening along. You haven't had a microphone, but it's your turn to come and make your voice heard. Come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode, you can leave your question, a comment, or more importantly, share your story of what's coming up for you. What are you thinking about as you're thinking about your Copilot auxiliary function? Is there healing work to do there? Is there trauma there that you need to work on? What will that look like for you? Are you going to make that gratitude list? Share it with us if you want to. That's cool. And then maybe share your story of what you plan to do, or maybe you've been through this experience and it was chaotic and you were worried. And then on the other end, it was a wonderful thing. And that would also help people to hear from you that was your experience too, that on the other side, there's hope. There's faith and hope on the other side of this trauma and not, feeling it's all together. Come over, make your voice heard. We want to hear from you.
That third person that didn't have a microphone, I think they're wondering if you had a microphone in this podcast.
It's fine.
I did a lot of talking. This was a chatty one for me. But they all kind of are, aren't they?
It's getting more so. You're going to be like that old person that just talks and we all just kind of listen to, right?
Oh my gosh, my dad tells us he's an ESTP.
This is an ET problem.
He tells the same stories over and over and over again.
You're starting to do that too,
It's a problem. It really is.
Like the last week, like 2 different days, you told, I think, the same story to our team on a team meeting or something. And I was like, oh, okay. It was a little different tact, but it was kind of the same story.
My dad is always surrounded by people who humor him. Just make sure you don't humor me.
Oh, no, I'm going to totally humor you.
No, because then I become one of those people. You can't let me be one of those people. But I probably already am, so the ship has sailed. All right, well, if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave us a rating and review on iTunes, that helps us out a lot. Our book is called Personality Hacker. It's available at all major book retailers. If you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. And, of course, this podcast never has ads, because it is subsidized by our business in which we offer personal growth programs. And so if you want to go to personalityhacker.com and look under our catalog, you might find a personal growth program tailored for you and your personality type. So go check it out and help support the podcast.
But you will find one for you tailored to your personality type. If it fits, that's up to you, but you definitely will. Yeah. Unless the website's down, I'm hoping it's all still there.
Yeah.
You will find one tailored to your personality type.
Well, yes, exactly. Whether or not it's a right fit for you at this time period in your life, that is something that you will have to determine. But you're right, there is one for every type.
My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.